my task is to speak about the sacred text. This whole weekend has been about sacred texts. And tonight I get to talk about sacred texts, all of which tell us that sacred texts aren't worth the paper they're printed on if you don't have the experience they are pointing you to, and if you don't live them. That is one consistent factor in the great literature of Vedanta. In the Bhagavad Gita, they say that or it is said, Krishna says that the enlightened, Vedic texts are as useless as the water in a well when the village is flooded. It's the old, the Buddhists say that the books are like the finger pointing to the moon, but they're not the moon. On the other hand, if it weren't for the texts, we wouldn't know there was a moon. We wouldn't know how to relate to the moon, how to understand the moon, how to connect to the moon. And so this is one of the great paradoxes of the spiritual life. We need the sacred texts to tell us to go beyond the texts. That's what happened to me. I'm going to begin, since I have had such a good time the last couple of days, meeting some of you and being treated so graciously here and seeing the grounds, because I'd written about Unity and I'd researched the history of Unity, but I'd never been here. And it's been a great joy for 2 days. So I feel like we all know each other, kind of, so I'm going to tell you a bit about myself that's pertinent. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and my parents were ethnic Jews who hated religion. To say I grew up in a secular household would be putting it mildly. It's not like that we didn't have any religion, it was anti-religion. My parents thought religion was the opium of the people, and anybody who was religious was basically a fool. And I didn't see the inside of a synagogue until I was old enough to be forced to attend other people's bar mitzvahs. And I didn't see the inside of a church till I had a crush on a Catholic girl in high school and went to midnight mass hoping to get somewhere, you know. And but then came the 1960s, which some of you may remember. And I was a college student, and I was a political activist, ending segregation and the Vietnam War. And at the same time, I was kind of lost and wondering, what am I doing here? And what is this all about? And who am I? And how do I connect to the larger world and universe? And how do you live in this world and attain some level of fulfillment? There must be answers to this. And I was getting nowhere from Marx or Freud or any of the other conventional sources of information and knowledge. I was a psychology major, and that didn't have the answers. I switched to sociology. That didn't have the answers. And eventually I dropped out of graduate school because nothing was satisfying me. And then, as part of the 60s, somehow I learned about Eastern philosophy and the great spiritual traditions that arose in India in ancient days. and in China, because I also learned about Taoism. And I read first about Vedanta and Buddhism from writers like Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley and Evelyn Underwood and others of that ilk. And that led me to the texts themselves. And I remember I was living in New York. I remember looking for something called a Bhagavad Gita. And believe it or not, it wasn't easy to find a copy then. And I had to, that's how I discovered Weiser's esoteric bookstore in Greenwich Village, because they had copies. And I read it, and it changed my life. And then I got a hold of Upanishads, and I read the Tao Te Ching, and read books about Vedanta written by Swamis, and books, interpretations by Adi Shankara. And my life changed because that, I remember having the thought, oh, if this is what religion's about, I've been seriously misled. Because I was, to me, growing up as I did, religion was just kind of primitive superstition. We had to believe in things that were irrational and not evidence-based. Whereas Vedanta and Buddhism seemed perfectly rational. And I remember having the thought, why do they call this mysticism? This seems very rational to me. It holds up to reason. It holds up to evidence. And no one's asking me to believe in anything that's outside the realm of reason and logic. And they're all saying it points to direct experience through these practices that come out of the repertoire of yoga, and that there's practical benefits to this. And I thought, well, I have to investigate this further. And I remember a very important moment. I by then had moved to Boston, and I went to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and I saw in a room called the Temple Room, Buddhist statuary for the first time. I had never seen that. To me, it was new. And I walked around the room looking at faces like that of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. And I thought, whatever those guys had, I want it. There was this peace and radiance, and I said, oh, there's promise here. I'm going to look into that. And that's how my life changed. And I took up Zen, and I wasn't happy with that form of meditation. Then, as you may recall, and we'll see later, the Beatles went to India and took up trance meditation. I said, okay, I'll try that, if it's good enough for John and George. And I did, and that pleased me a lot. And it changed my life. And I became a teacher of TM in 1970, and went from this bedraggled 2-pack-a-day cigarette smoking miserable person to this guy. I'm sorry. I had to do this because I just came across this picture recently, and it's just too much fun. I showed it to my 8-year-old nephew the other day, and he said, "That's you? What happened?" And I figured, this is like the beginning of his spiritual journey, like when Siddhartha Gautama, went out and saw old age for the first time. Now, well, let's get a better image up. Okay, so now I want to tell you a slight digression, but this is the only audience I could tell this to. So I became a TM teacher, and There was this one weirdo in my family, in my extended family on both sides, because everybody else was these, working class union member, anti-religious, secular people. Good, deep, and warm people, but no, religion was off the table, except for my mother's older sister, who at that time we thought of her as the old lady of the family. She's probably 60, or in her 60s. And she lived in Philadelphia, and somehow in midlife or later in life, she found religion. And my mother was totally confused. She adored her sister. They were very close, but she said, well, and it's not like she found the Judaism of her heritage. She went to church on Sundays, and this was inconceivable in my household. But they had an agreement that when we got together, you didn't talk about that sort of thing, and everybody had a good old time. Well, my aunt, Esther, heard that I was teaching meditation. I was going to be in Philadelphia, and she invited me to come visit. I hadn't seen her in a long time. And I was thinking, this was the age in the 70s when the term Jesus freak first came out, and I thought, oh God, I hope she doesn't, try to convert me or, tell me Jesus is the one true Messiah. I couldn't take it from my lovely aunt. Well, we had a great time for a couple of days. She asked me to teach her to meditate. She was into all this mystical and esoteric things. She did my horoscope. And she had done the horoscope of everybody in my family, and she had all these books, and it was incredible. And there was no hint of anything I couldn't tolerate. And we had a great time. And then I left, and I never saw her again because a couple of years later she passed. And years later, many years later, maybe 20, I was going through some boxes of books. And I came upon a book that she gave me when I visited her, and I never read it, except for the inscription in it. And the book is B by James Dillett Freeman. And I opened it up, and I saw Unity School of Christianity, 1957. And I realized my aunt, that's the church she went to. She was going to a Unity church, and that explained a lot, and that's the first. And that's the first I ever heard of Unity. Was when I opened this book and said she was into something different. This was not church lady. This was different, and so that's the first I ever heard of Unity. And of course, subsequently, I've learned a lot about Unity, and I've gone to many Unity churches and have spoken at Unity congregations, and always felt at home, always felt welcome, and always felt I was among kindred spirits, despite my being a Hindu. And so I was always, now of course I wish I had more time with Aunt Esther at that time. But anyway, so I've always felt at home, and so if any of you want me to come and address your congregation, please feel free to invite me, especially if your church is in Hawaii. or I don't know, is there a Paris Unity? Not yet. Okay. So, that little episode with my aunt aside, my story is not at all unusual. I mean, the particulars are different, but people turning to the East as young people who are feeling alienated from religion or anti the religion of their upbringing, or who are just secular seekers searching for more fulfillment and inner transformation, discovering the East often through the sacred texts or through one of the many gurus and swamis and yoga masters who have come, who embody and represent the wisdom in these texts. It has been repeated so many thousands of times, And then those people become transmitters of these core teachings. That over time, this transmission from India to here has had a tremendous impact, not just on individuals, but on the culture as a whole. That's what American Veda is about. And by the way, my other two books aren't for sale here, but I wanted to mention them anyway. And that impact on individuals and the culture as a whole has been profound, and it has been so subtle that it is often unrecognized. But it is safe to say that everyone in this room has been affected by India and the core teachings that came from the Vedic tradition. And if you don't think that's true, you will know it's true soon, by the end of my talk, if not in the next 5 minutes. And if you don't, you may not know the extent to which you've been affected by it, because most people don't. Because important, influential people in American life were deeply influenced by these teachings, assimilated them, adapted them, absorbed them, combined them with their own insights, their own fields of expertise, changed their form of expression, integrated it into other sources of wisdom, and then became transmitters, and we've all been affected by these people. So I'm going to read a quote and show it. The Christian religion this is provocative stuff. The Christian religion has answered our needs up to the present age, but the evolution of the spirit has created a demand for a religion of broader scope, and we turn to the lore of India for a lack of a better system near home. Do you know who said that? No cheating if you heard me give a talk before. Do you know who said that? Any guesses?
One of Buddha's followers, like one of his...
It was Charles Fillmore. He said that in an essay in the second issue of the magazine then called Modern Thought that became Unity magazine. The year was 1889. And I'm indebted to a guy named Dave DeLuca who found that here in the archives and shared it with me when I was researching American Veda. And I saw it. I didn't just take his word for it. And in that same article, Charles Fillmore called India, or the East in general, the nursery of spiritual philosophies and the storehouse of a spiritual life that we cannot adequately comprehend in our present material thought environment. So the Fillmores, Charles and Myrtle, were both profoundly influenced by India's sacred texts at that time. But not just directly through those texts. In that same issue of the magazine, there was a poem, a complete poem reproduced. And the poem was called Brahma. And the first stanza is, if the red slayer thinks he slays, or if the slain think he is slain, they know not well the subtle ways I keep and pass and turn again. Do you know who wrote that? That was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And as you all know, probably, Emerson was one of the chief influences on Charles and Myrtle Fillmore in those days. But what you may not know is the degree to which Emerson was influenced by the Vedic literature that he grew up with.